Morning, everyone. Welcome to installment 2 of Portrait of a Lady. I'm going to start today by reminding you what I said last week about Minnie Temple, James's cousin, whom he admired her greatly. He admired her intellect, her quickness, but she died young of TB. And this, in his mind, was it was an incompleteness in her life. Isabel is able to explore beyond what Minnie Temple could. And remember, I also told you that Minnie Temple is in some ways the basis, the starting point for Isabel. Isabel isn't exactly like Minnie, but does resemble her. But Isabel has the advantage of being able to continue to experience. I have a quote from Henry James that says, "Experience is never limited, and it is never complete. It is an immense sensibility, a kind of huge spider web." That's exactly what this novel is. It is an immense spider web of possibilities. Isabel is being talked about, not in a bad way. People are discussing her. We see her from the narrator's point of view. We see her from the other character's point of view. And from that, we will watch her respond to experience. So from here, go to back to Gora. This is a really, really, really interesting book. Um, I think I told you that one of the chapters is that he is a native of no country. And that's interesting because we know that he was an expatriate and that he eventually moved to England permanently. And his entire upbringing was going back and forth. When he was 25 years old, which would be 1869, he had been taken to Europe as a child, but this was his first visit as an adult, a stay of 14 months that would take him through England and France and down into Italy. They are the months in which the figure we know as Henry James became recognizably himself, the months in which he began to inhabit the transatlantic world he would make so distinctively his own. He is distinctively his own person. If we want to understand him, we need to take account of some of the people in his life. I already did quite a bit of this last week with his brother William, but one of the contentions is that James Sr. created such, this is Henry James's father, created such a peculiar education for these two. And there were other children. I mentioned those two. There were two more boys and a girl. But for these two, they were intellectually superior to just about everybody else. To understand it, we need to look at their parents, in particular their father, Henry James Sr. The Jameses lived in great comfort, but also, in Henry Sr.'s case, in great pain. At 13, he was so badly burned in trying to put out a fire that he lay bedridden for years and finally lost a leg. He became an adept user of the day's prosthetics, with a cork leg stumping along on the sidewalk. What he did with his leisure, because he had a lot of money, was to become one of the most incoherent of American religious thinkers. That's his father. He's incoherent and he was all over the place. The elder senior, the elder Henry James found his true career in the peculiar education he constructed for his children. Um, they went back and forth to England, then back to America, then back to England. James gives Isabel a version of this upbringing, describing her as having neither a settled home nor a coherent education. But he adds that Isabel herself would dispute that description and believed that her own opportunities had been abundant. And we are going to see her in the first chapters of this book going on going on an adventure with Mrs. Touchette to England. Um, Henry was a quiet boy with a marked stammer. I'd forgotten that he had a bad stutter, and he was happiest when left alone. William was energy embodied, and his plans and ambitions seemed to change by the week. Um, More important, that experience reinforced the family's sense of isolation from the central experiences of American life. Um, Years later, our Henry, wrote that their expatriation left them interested in almost nothing but each other. I thought that was really, really interesting. It's hard to figure if we're just going to look at Henry James's biography, the chronology that's in your book. It's hard to figure out why he became such an expatriate, but they were immersed in their own life. And his words give some point to William's 1889 statement that the novelist was a native of the James family and has no other country. When I was growing up, I actually knew a family like that who were so immersed in each other you could never really be friends with them because they had so many inside jokes and you just weren't a part of it. That the later Here's a note about Alice, the younger sister, and the terrain that Alice had to negotiate looked especially trackless and strange. Her father believed that women had their lives in a separate and subordinate sphere, and she did not share her brother's education. She was taught instead at home and spent her adult life as an invalid, the victim of indefinable ailments that kept her in bed for years at a time, apparently unable to walk. Yet she had a caustic tongue, which her brothers enjoyed, even if Henry also found himself disturbed after her 1892 death from breast cancer by the frank and immediate pain of the diary she left behind. Um, so here is another woman whose life is cut short and who could never complete her experience. And through Isabel, we see James exploring what potentially could have been her experience. Um, I told you about that. Um, so at the beginning of the novel, we meet Ralph Touchette, the son of the Mr. and Mrs. Touchette, who also has consumption, much like Minnie Temple. Okay. Oh, yeah. He mourned the death of two cousins and read and reread his brother's letters home, but his own record was one of seeing, sharing, envying, applauding, pitying, all from far off. He never had to prove himself as they did, and he never lost his sense of what I missed. Um, I already told you that about. Now let's take a look at Ralph. I've got a little scrap of paper. No, we're not going to Ralph yet. Oh, this was super interesting. Garden Court is the estate of the Touchettes, and it was clearly patterned after a place called Hardwick, a place that James had visited. And here's a description of Hardwick, and you will see that it is in fact very much like Garden Court. It is a Tudor building, a good deal bruised and defaced in Cromwell's wars, and some 40 miles upstream from London, like Garden Court. The words come from the novel, but the facts are confirmed by architectural historian Nicholas Pevsner, and both writers note the irregularity of its bricks and gables. The Thames runs placidly here, and in the novel's early chapters, James describes Ralph and Isabel as spending some of their time in a rowboat on the Thames. A 1906 article in the magazine Country Life claims, in fact, that there is no more beautiful reach of the river than that upon which Hardwick terraces look down. And Garden Court is just that idealized place. Um, so, yeah. So, just put this here. This is all with the intent of understanding James so that we can understand where he's going in the book. This is in an article by Charlotte Bean, and it's in a text called Critical Insights. The title of it is Henry James and the Dilemma of Young Americans Abroad. As a writer of fiction, Henry James rarely fits into any neat category. In terms of national or regional cultural identity, this indefinability is particularly striking. Although he was born in New York and raised in a fashionable area, James is not exclusively an American writer. He spent too much time abroad to hold on to his nationality in his published works. His style and thematic preoccupations were far too strongly influenced by his distinctly European experiences. As his experiences as an American writer in a self-imposed exile from the country of his birth forces us to consider him not merely as an American writer, but an international and multicultural writer, a writer of blended national identity captured both by American and European culture. And we see this almost immediately within the, I don't know, I think it's 5, 6, and 7, and 8. The American culture is being compared to European culture. The difficulty with James is particularly acute because he so actively considers the conflicts between American and cultural identities. Another of James's central preoccupations was the way in which American culture and the United States sought to establish itself not only as a unifying force, forging a national identity, but also on the international stage in relation to other more established cultures and nationality. We have seen that in other books that were written in the period, even in some of the short stories. That the American in Europe is explored by many authors. James juxtaposes American values with European ones to emphasize these very issues. Um, he portrays the former as highly idealistic, the Americans, romantic and naive, while the latter are dubiously materialistic and opportunistic. Indeed, James often develops his characters and stories to emphasize Americans as being at a distinct disadvantage in European society. Um, Americans didn't necessarily understand the cultural norms of England. And we see that at the end of, I think it's chapter 6, when Isabel and um, Warburton and Ralph are sitting in the parlor, and Mrs. Touchette wants to go to bed, and so she makes Isabel go with her, and Isabel doesn't understand that. I remember when I was in Italy one time, people said you could always see you could always identify American women because A, they wore tennis shoes, which I thought was hilarious because that's probably true, and B, the women walked around alone. They were unescorted. And we see James is very quick in some of these chapters to tell us that Isabel is escorted. James views them not only as romantics and idealists, but also as victims, very literally out of their intellectual depth among Europeans. It is not simply a matter of relative weakness. Of Isabel Archer, one critic observes that she is not merely more democratic and freer than the Europeans whom she's encountered. So make note of that as you are making your way through the book. Notice how many times she is identified as independent. She identifies herself as independent. She is pure and more honest. If she is headstrong, naive, abrupt, even blunt, she's also shiningly incontrovertibly good. That was from Auchincloss. Now they're going to start to bark. Part of James's reckoning of American versus European cultural and national identity suggests that Americans' experience in Europe is, at least in part, a tragedy. James's American heroes and heroines, in particular, tend to be made unhappy or even done to death by a cynical, dirty-minded old Europe. James maintained a clear notion of an international conflict centered around this problem. That's really important, that James's American heroes and heroines, in particular, tend to be made unhappy or even done to death by a cynical, dirty-minded old Europe. James maintained a clear notion of the international conflict centered around this problem. He developed it, too, as a struggle of good versus evil, the brave new world against the wicked old, in several of his novels and short stories. And while this is an underlying thematic in our novel, it isn't as cut and dry as that seems, because, as I have mentioned, Isabel's experience is flushed out on a kind of stage so that Ralph can talk about her. Warburton can talk about her. The how she responds to in different situations gives her a reality that isn't just a black and white conflict. Here we go. So one more thing. This is the same author, but she goes on in another section to talk about James and his theory of fiction. Considering the scope of James's portrait of the contrasting American and European characters as it exists in many of his major novels, including Portrait, readers are still left to wonder about the precise reasoning for this contrast. It is tempting, too, from a biographical point of view, to wonder how much of the American vulnerability and newness James actually connected to and engaged with himself. Although answering these questions definitively is virtually impossible. And that's something that I'm trying to get at. He explored these without giving us the answer. One way to consider James's attitude is to specifically isolate his representation of American and European values within the scope of his fiction. James believed that the novelist is as occupied with looking for the truth as is the historian. And remember, he was close friends with William Dean Howells, and between them, they both believed in the reality, the truthful treatment of things. James, he believed that the novelist's function, as much as anything, was to represent the way things are and the way things have been, thus providing a social and historical commentary. James intended to make a record of the experience of being an American in Europe, or at least the experience of interacting with Europeans as an American. He took the position that he had, which was the other. And we just saw that his family recognized that about themselves. But now he is the other in Europe. The key point is that he had a particular focus on realism. What he represents of the American struggle in European society is apparently intended as an accurate and true reflection. What he shows as characteristic of European attitudes and values, the close versus the open, the restrained versus the free, he intends as representative. So, what we are going to see in Isabel is that she sees herself as freer, but then we examine whether or not she is freer by seeing her flushed out against the backdrop. Okay, I'm going to come back to that part later. So let's. Oh, I have to tell you something about Ralph. I think I would probably perish if I didn't have sticky notes. It's how I organize my world. Um, Ralph was, like Henry James, um, enrolled at Harvard, and then he went to Oxford, and he is sitting lazily upon a stool at his father's bank. So he actually had an occupation for a while. Remember, his father, Mr. Touchette, is an American, but he's been in England for 30 years because he came to England and was a very successful banker and made a lot of money. Now, Ralph Jr. doesn't really have an occupation, though he did at first. He is a spectator devoted to the ironic appreciation of the world around him. Even before his disease, the TB, sets in, it seems to the people he knows as if he will be shut out from a career. So he did at first have a career at his father's bank, but then his the TB set in. Then his lungs began to go, and he resembles Minnie in at first viewing his illness as that of an uninteresting person with whom he had nothing in common. The picture of Ralph in the novel's early chapters is almost as detailed as that of Isabel herself, and part of the impression she makes on us comes from Ralph's sense that she has changed his own life. Remember, we're going to look at this. Ralph had been pretty depressed, and then suddenly Isabel appears on the horizon, and it's like a bit of light. By the way, the dog that was barking out there was Isabel. She's the barker. None of the other ones do that. Just Isabel. Um, maybe because she's more independent. The picture. This doesn't make the. And part of the impression she makes on us comes from Ralph's sense that she has changed his own life. Let's therefore ask the same question of him that he does of his mother. What will he do with her? And what will she do? That's the question. What's she going to do? Ralph is willing enough to fall in love, but he believes it must be a passive experience, a silent one. Remember, he articulates that. He says, "Am I in love with her? No." And then he convinces himself even more that he's not. Illness has confirmed his habit of watching, and the richest entertainment he can now imagine lies in the conscious observation of a lovely woman. Still, he recognizes that so far he has only looked in at the window. So, especially in these early chapters, he doesn't know her well. He's only looking in a little bit. The door to her inner being remains locked, and perhaps the house isn't yet ready for viewing. The furniture still being moved from place to place. When we turn to the novel momentarily, we will see that Ralph and his father are sitting out on the lawn, where they often sit, and it's as if it's a room. The curious thing is that James also uses the language of architecture to define Isabel's attitude towards wealth. She wants to see the life hidden behind his joking facade, to pass through the anteroom and enter the private apartments of himself. Almost everyone who reads the portrait of a lady sees Ralph and Isabel as one of fiction's great might have beens, and the consonance in the language with which they think of one another confirms their essential harmony. So that's something else to watch. Not only Isabel's reference to herself as free and wanting to maintain that independent, but they also share the ability to describe each other in architectural terms. Um, we'll get to that in a minute. Let us then finally at the novel. And if we go to page, I don't know what it is, the first page, page 3, James sets the scene for us. And this is Garden Court, which, as I demonstrate, is patterned after a real place called Hardwick. It is an old English country house in which I should call the perfect middle of a splendid summer afternoon. Part of the afternoon had waned, but much of it was left, and what was left was of the finest and rarest quality. Notice the languid description. Nobody's going much of anywhere, and the two men are very much enjoying this afternoon. They lengthen slowly, the shadows do, however, and the scene expresses that sense of leisure still to come, which is perhaps the chief source of one's enjoyment of such a scene at such an hour. So, the best thing in the world would be to take this page and go and sit on your patio and enjoy the afternoon because it's just magnificent. Um, the shadows on the perfect lawn were straight and angular, and I'm moving down the page, by the way. They were shadows of an old man sitting in a deep wicker chair near the low table on which the tea had been served, and the two younger men strolling to and fro in desultory talk in front of him. So Ralph is having a conversation with Warburton, and the old man, of course, is Mr. Touchette. And if we go to the top of the page 4, this is set to us as the end of the first incomplete paragraph. The house that rose beyond the lawn was a structure to repay such consideration and was the most characteristic object in the peculiarly English picture I have attempted to sketch. Um, and then James goes through and gives a history, which is in fact very much like Hardwick. Let's see, had been built under Edward VI, had offered a night's hospitality to the great Elizabeth, in whose august person had extended itself upon a huge, magnificent, and terribly angular bed, which still formed the principal honor of the sleeping apartments. Um, Now, just as an aside, Elizabeth was about 4'11", Elizabeth I, and they slept in beds that were not comfy, cozy like ours. In fact, if you've ever been to Ford's Theater in where Lincoln was shot, the bed he was on was also this kind of hard, short. They were short, even though Lincoln was quite tall. And then he goes on to say that this was bruised and defaced in Cromwell's wars, like Hardwick. And he goes on to say restoration, repair, and much enlarged, and how finally, after having been remodeled and disfigured in the 18th century, it had been passed into a careful keeping of a shrewd American banker. That's Touchette himself. He made apparently quite a deal to get the place. Go over to page 5. The great still oaks and beeches flung down a shade, the beech trees, as dense as that of velvet curtains, and the place was furnished like a room with cushioned seats and rich colored rugs with the books and papers that lay upon the grass. Now, I don't know if they brought out the rugs every single day. My first thought would be, aren't they going to get wet? But apparently that isn't what happens in an idealized English countryside. The river was at some distance. There's the Thames. Where the ground began to slope, the lawn, properly speaking, ceased. But it was none the less a charming walk down the walk to the water. So here's Touchette. He's sitting out there. He's drinking his tea. He's clearly perhaps a little ill. We learn later that he's got gout. Um, and that doesn't seem to go away. He also has a beautiful collie dog. It's just a really lovely picture. The top of page 6, we meet our very handsome and desirable Warburton, Lord Warburton. He's a remarkably well-made man of 5 and 30, with a face as English as that of the old gentleman I have just sketched, and was something else. We have to really pay attention to Warburton. Um, you've probably gotten as far as you were supposed to today, but Warburton is an aristocrat, very wealthy. He's he has the name Warburton, even though he's got, I think, 5 siblings. And interestingly, we'll see this in a minute. The next sibling, a brother, is a vicar, because that's what families did. The oldest son inherited the title and the need to support the rest of them, but the second son often became part of the church. And we'll see later that he's not that religious. Um, Isabel says something like, she doesn't seem to get any real enlightenment from him. It was just an occupation. Um, all right, we see Ralph a little bit lower down on the page. Tall, lean, loosely, and feebly put together. That's quite the contrast to Warburton, who's handsome and brilliant. He's booted and spurred as if he had dismounted from a long ride. He wore a white hat, dogskin gloves. That's appalling. I meant to cross that off. Um, he looked clever and ill, and that is exactly Ralph. He is clever and ill. You could see that they are father and son, the old man and younger Ralph. They are father and son. The father has a sorry.